My name is Yoni Yaris, and I work for the Prisma. Welcome to the 2017 Moot Bait Dean competition, and thank you to everyone who is joining us here today and watching via the live stream on YouTube. Before we begin the competition, everyone please turn off your cell phones so that we do not interrupt the presentations. I will pause now so you can now turn off your cell phones. Thank you. We are in the Cardozo 2 division. The teams competing in this division are Abraham Joshua Heschel High School, Kiva Hebrew High School, Beth Shalom Synagogue, Yachad, Tarbut V'Torah, Del Toledo High School, and Denver Jewish Day School. We would like to thank the judges who are not only with us today, but have invested time and thought in reading and providing feedback on your written decisions. I'd like to invite the judges to each stand and introduce themselves to the room.
Do you want us to come up there? Do you want us to be over there? Anybody want to? Or just turn around? Here. Okay. Well, we need to be, I think, mic'd for. There you go. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Still good morning. I'm Rabbi Dan Aronson. I am the Director of Youth and Education at one of our local conservative congregations, the Director or Coordinator of their Bar Mitzvah program at one of our larger Reform congregations. I've been involved in Jewish education, academic administration for many years. I'm ordained at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and I've been living here in Houston for 4 years. This has been a wonderful experience reading all of your decisions. I admire all the hard work. We put in a lot of work in reading them and analyzing them, and we know that that follows up on a lot of work on your part. So I want to congratulate all of you for the hard work that you've done to get to this point.
Hi, I'm Jeff Lefkowitz. I'm a lawyer and an arbitrator and a Jewish history teacher. I'm not going to talk as long as Dan because I'm not a rabbi, but congratulations to everybody, and we look forward to hearing the arguments.
Once again, thank you to our judges. Now on to the rules. The competition works as follows. Each team will have 8 minutes for presentations, and there will be an 8-minute for Q&A from the judges. Our timekeeper is Rabbi Mikey Stein, located in the front row. He will give each team a 1-minute warning and then a 30-second warning. Even if you are mid-sentence, you have to stop. You do not need to use your full 8 minutes for presentation, and the judges do not need to use their full 8 minutes for questions. There will be a 5-minute break between each team, and at the start of the break, the timekeeper will invite the next team to sit up on the stage. There will also be 2 longer breaks throughout the competition. After the final team has presented, there will be a lunch break, and the judges will deliberate, followed by a closing ceremony at 12:30 in Sam Houston. For those watching the live stream, to view the closing ceremony, go to the Prisma CJS YouTube channel at 12:30. Thank you all, B'Has L'cha. The first team up is Abraham Joshua High School. I apologize. Just switch your display over.
What grade are you on?
11.
Excuse me. And we're live.
All right.
Good morning. Rachel Rubenstein took her new self-driving car out to purchase groceries. Since the car does not require a driver, Rachel was busy listening to a podcast in transit. Suddenly, Rachel's self-driving car T-boned Shimon Shalom's car in the opposite lane. After pulling herself out of her car, Rachel found that Shimon had been seriously injured in the accident and called for an ambulance. A few witnesses of the accident explained to Rachel that her car swerved out of the way to save the life of a pedestrian who had appeared out of nowhere. It was assumed that at the speed that Rachel's car was going at, the pedestrian would have been killed by impact. Shimon's injuries required an extended hospital stay. After a full recovery, Shimon sued Rachel in the Beit Din for full damages, including the cost of his hospital stay, his time away from work, and the damages done to his car. Rachel, on the other hand, argued that the incident is not her fault, since she had absolutely no control of her car or its actions due to its self-driving ability. She said that had it been in her control, she would have slammed on the brakes, causing no damage to Shimon's car. Rachel argued that Shimon should sue the company who manufactures and programs the car, Oliva Industries, since they are the ones responsible for the car's swerving, which caused all damages done to Shimon. Rachel and Shimon have come to our Beit Din in order to settle their disputes. As we've applied the sources in this case, we, the Beit Din, believe that both Rachel Rubenstein and Oliva Industries share responsibility for the expenses incurred to Mr. Shalom, and that they should split these costs.
We determined that Rachel's relation to the car can be most closely compared with the relationship of a fire starter to the fire they start. So the first source is Bava Kama 9b10a, which describes a fire as having a nature to move around, and it's considered forewarned to consume both appropriate things and inappropriate things. So the description is very similar to the self-driving car in this case, in that the car also moves around and may cause damage in a way that's not known to Rachel because she has no understanding of the car's programming, much like the fire starter has no understanding of how the fire will behave. So then Shemot 22:5 states that he who started the fire must make restitution. So in this case, by starting the car, Rachel was essentially starting a fire, like in Bava Kama 9b10a. Therefore, she's responsible for the damages that the car causes, as the fire starter is responsible for the damages that their fire causes, like in Shemot 22:5. Now, fundamentally, Rachel is the legal owner of the car, so she's therefore liable for damages, according to Mishnah Bava Kama 1:1, which states that guarding the things that cause damage is your responsibility, and when they damage, the liable party is obligated to pay. Therefore, she's at least in part obligated to pay damage reparations, as she failed to guard her fire from damaging after she started it. Now, while it might seem that because Rachel had no ability to control the car, she should not be held liable for the damages it caused, she nevertheless is responsible, as is set out in Bava Kama 2:6, which states that a person is always considered warned or fully liable, whether accidental or intentional, whether awake or asleep. So the idea is that in this case, because Rachel can't control the car, she's just like someone who is asleep, in that they can't control the car, but someone who's asleep is still liable for damages. Therefore, we believe that she would still be liable, at least in part, for damages. However, she's not entirely responsible for the damages because she was willfully deprived of the ability to control the car by Oliva Industries. It's not a total failure on her part.
As Gidon said, Oliva Industries is also a responsible party for the damages done to Mr. Shalom and his car. Oliva Industries' relationship with Rachel's car is most closely defined as the relationship between an ox and his owner. An ox is defined differently than that of a fire. Both cause damages and their owners are held responsible for their damages. However, while a fire by default is understood to spread and consume things, an ox's owner is expected to prevent their ox from damaging someone's property, particularly if that ox is in a habit of goring. The heightened danger holds the owner to a higher responsibility to contain his ox. Rachel had no control over her car, and thus some of the blame is shifted to Oliva Industries. Shemot 21:35-36 talks about an owner and a goring ox, saying, if it is known that the ox was in the habit of goring and its owner has failed to guard it, he must restore ox for ox. In this situation, Rachel never had the opportunity to guard the ox and therefore cannot be considered the owner. The only person, according to this source, who could have controlled the goring ox is Oliva Industries, the company that programmed the car itself. Oliva Industries created a goring ox and knowingly set it loose. Therefore, Oliva Industries shares responsibility with Rachel for the damages. Rachel's control is just like one who starts a fire. The damages are sparked by the ignition of the fire, which by its nature cannot be controlled. Oliva is like one who owns an ox. They are supposed to ensure that their ox does not damage the property of others, especially when this ox is known to be violent. In this situation, since both Oliva Industries and Rachel have ownership and some sort of responsibility, it is ambiguous who should pay for what reparations. Gemara Bava Kama 35b states, money whose ownership is in doubt is equally divided, meaning that since both Rachel and Oliva have stake in reparations, they can be split.
The damage in Rachel's car crash leads to an important question. Can we keep the current design of the Oliva self-driving car? In Ketubot 19a, it states that while you must do everything to save a life, you cannot murder. You cannot choose to take a life to save one. The difficulty, however, is that a case like this could have very possibly ended with death. If the Oliva car had been forced to choose between hitting one pedestrian or two pedestrians in a sudden, inescapable situation, it would hit the single pedestrian in an effort to save the most life. This seems to be a violation of the prohibition of killing to save another life. Our response to that is as follows. The car is attempting to reduce fatalities. It is choosing to kill the fewest amount of people. It is not a matter of whose blood is redder or who deserves to live, but rather how many people will survive the car crash. Rachel's crash was not the result of a decision made right before Rachel's car hit Shimon's. The decision of how to configure the car was made back when the designers and engineers behind the car invented the radar that could scan obstacles and other cars in the road. Those behind Oliva released a powerful machine that they had created to save as much human life in an emergency as possible. Since the Oliva car was never made with the intention of killing anyone, it did not murder. Crashes like Rachel's and Shimon's are infinitely rarer than those of a manual car because humans are often unable to make such calculations and are reckless when facing an emergency on the road. As for the rule about not damaging property to save oneself, presented in Bava Kama 60b, the self-driving car does not try to save itself. In the Bava Kama case, the Israelites could not invade the stacks of barley where the enemy was hiding in a preemptive attack. The Israelites are not like the Oliva car because the Israelites wanted to attack only because they wanted to protect themselves. The Oliva car would be willing to total itself if it meant preserving the most life possible.
I have a question. Have y'all considered the possibility that the pedestrian might have some responsibility here?
We did consider that, and it's fairly clear that the whole situation was obviously started because of the pedestrian, and we wouldn't be here in the first place if it wasn't for them. But the case did say that it would be impossible to find the pedestrian and to apply blame to the pedestrian. So if the issue at hand is to find out who should be responsible for paying the reparations, someone must be paying the reparations. So we determined that it would be best to find one of the parties that should be responsible for paying these.
So if you can't find the pedestrian, does that mean that you can't ascribe blame to the pedestrian?
I think that we thought that just realistically it would be nearly impossible to blame a pedestrian who is jaywalking every time there's a result of that, which has injury. And if you can't track them down and they weren't impacted by the situation, it would be very hard to bring charges against them.
Do I hear you suggesting that jaywalking is just such a common occurrence that the car maker ought to have taken into account that people jaywalk and maybe needed to program the car accordingly?
Well,
or is jaywalking it's sort of an aberrant behavior that would not reasonably be anticipated?
So while jaywalking shouldn't happen and people should be more mindful of how these things do affect others and how Mr. Shalom was injured because of this pedestrian's jaywalking, the car company did program it to deal with such predicament, and that's why Mr. Shalom got injured. So we think they did take it into account, but we think that Oliva Industries is more accountable for the fact that they programmed it in such a way that Mr. Shalom was going to be hurt and that the pedestrian was completely spared in this scenario. But since the pedestrian was spared, we do not think that they can be held responsible.
I would like to add that we covered the idea of an inescapable situation that the car would get into. All self-driving car crashes are triggered by obstacles, by people who are not where they should be, and there's no place to go. And I think that we recognize that there is some responsibility in the pedestrian and in people for potentially creating these situations. But I agree with Gidon and Shira, and I think that we really could not place blame, we could not ask the pedestrian to pay reparations, and so we pointed out that the pedestrian is a problem and creates problems for self-driving cars, but we cannot prosecute them.
So are you troubled at all by concluding that Aliva programmed the car the way they should have, and yet they should still pay money?
There's a difference between not being allowed to have a car and having that kind of behavior ethically unacceptable. And we think that these situations are so rare that when they do occur, you must still pay reparations, obviously, but we found that ethically it's okay. And so ethically, this car is doing everything it can. It is configured so that it will make the choice that will save the most lives. So ideally, it is doing what it should be. When there is this kind of an inescapable situation, they must still be held responsible.
And while we commend Aliva Industries for programming their car in such a way where it's meant to save the most amount of lives and not injure anybody, these situations, like Emma said, are rare and are very unfortunate, and Mr. Shalom did suffer a lot from this situation. So I think Aliva, in having their self-driving cars and programming it the way it was programmed, they have to take responsibility also for the fault that it might cause accidents as such, and they should give some reparations to Mr. Shalom for the fact that it was programmed as such. But like Emma said, that doesn't mean they should completely start over.
I have one question about the car as fire. So I forget who was making the argument about the car as fire. Okay. So one of the things you said was that the person who started the fire has no knowledge of how the fire will spread. And the person is forewarned. And I'm wondering if you think that's true, that once you start a fire, you have no knowledge, you're not able to anticipate at all what happens with that fire.
Right. Now, a person should be able to have a general idea of how a fire might behave, but we're talking about like specifically, I don't know what course the fire might take, what direction the wind is blowing in. I'm talking about like in the general conditions that would cause the fire to go certain places. Like the fire-specific behavior isn't known to the person who starts it, but like the general concepts of fire, I guess, might be known.
And so applied to the
right.
car.
Right. Applied to the car. The idea is that when when Rachel presses the button and starts the car, she like has a general idea of the car will be following the rules of the road, or the car will get me from point A to point B. But it's like a very rudimentary understanding of what the car will be doing. She doesn't know specific information about like what the parameters of the programming are, what choices it'll make, or anything.
Could that also be applied to Aliva?
Well, I mean.
Because if they did the programming, right?
Right.
They certainly couldn't know the specifics of the situation in which the car would have to respond.
Right. So yeah, they wouldn't know exactly. I mean, they're not. There's no person there consciously making these decisions like on the fly. But I mean, they did program the parameters by which the car decides what decisions it makes when it encounters these situations.
So in saying so, they supposedly have a better understanding of the car's route and what it might do in these situations than Rachel does, which is why we characterized it as a fire for Rachel and not for Aliva Industries, because you could argue that it's just like a fire for Aliva Industries as well, but since they are responsible and their name is on the car, they obviously have more of a knowledge, and that little bit of knowledge, whether it's huge or whether it's tiny, whether they know every situation or they just know the hypotheticals, that does change a lot, and it does detract from Rachel's responsibility. And while Rachel might get into a car and be fully aware that she can get into an accident, nobody should ever get into their car thinking this car might get into an accident. What happens then?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks so
much.
much.
Well
Thank you.
done.
All right. All right.
5 minute break, please stay in the room. Have a heat rise.